to stay on the genes for a moment, obviously something that's been in the air for a while, that's been discussed, in academic circles and by anyone, is the autism spectrum
Yes.
and diagnoses and et cetera, et cetera. Now with RFK Jr. making America something again back in the White House, this conversation is coming up, and I think in September when he comes out with his report, his scientific report of what causes it, I think it's going to be the biggest this has ever been discussed, even before when Jenny McCarthy was saying vaccines, etc. And so I'm wondering if you feel comfortable talking about this, or if it's come across your your research lab, etc. How you think about it, because
Sure.
And I want to preface it as well that obviously autism is not one thing. There's a enormous spectrum for what these are. So I'd love if you could speak to, if you have an idea for why these diagnoses seems to be getting, not exponentially, but growing quite quickly over over the years, and what you think in general.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me, because this is an issue that I work on quite a bit, and it's a struggle to communicate, because the answer, the story is really complex, right? And people don't like complex stories.
Sure.
And by people I mean, for example, journalists and media, for example, will often like a nice simple story like vaccines cause autism, or your gut microbiome causes autism, or
Right.
chemtrails, or fluoride, or pesticides, or dental floss, or whatever it is today.
Right.
Right? So it's hard to counter those kinds of stories with the real story, which is complex, but I'll try. So autism is, first of all, the main reason why the diagnoses are going up is because psychiatrists have just expanded the diagnostic criteria over recent years, and you can track the way the diagnoses have gone up based on when those criteria have been changed in this sort of manual that psychiatrists use.
Right.
So what's interesting,
the DSM.
Exactly. So they've widened the criteria, so many more people fit the just the sort of diagnostic definition, which is a construct, right? People get together, psychiatrists get together and say, okay, here's the criteria that we're going to say meet the diagnosis of autism, and sometimes those change, right? So that's not like they're identifying truth when they do that. It's a convention of who gets the label. Okay? What's
Right.
interesting is, as the rates of people being diagnosed with autism have gone up, the rates of people being diagnosed with just intellectual disability, or what in the States used to be called mental retardation, are going down. And the reason is that people who used to be called mentally retarded are now being called autistic. Right? So there's a substitution of one diagnosis for another, which just doesn't fit at all with the idea of some kind of an epidemic, where, the idea of an epidemic almost screams out that there must be some cause in the environment. There must be something causing it out there in the world that's affecting our kids and making them.
Well, it's like that funny saying, like, everything is conspiracy if you don't understand how anything works.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, in this case, it's actually understandable given the data, right? If you just look at the prevalence and you say that's a prevalence of disease as opposed to a prevalence of diagnosis, right? If you make that mistake, which is very easy to make, it seems reasonable to say there must be some environmental cause, right? But there's no evidence for any environmental cause whatsoever. Like vaccines, for example, have been studied so much in millions and millions of kids, comparing the rates of autism in kids who were vaccinated to kids who weren't, and there's no difference. I mean, in millions of kids, right?
Right.
So what there is very good evidence for is a genetic causation, but complex, right? So we know hundreds of different genes that mutations in those genes increase the risk of autism. And you could say the same thing for intellectual disability, for epilepsy, for inherited deafness, for inherited blindness. There's just a whole bunch of genetic conditions that manifest in different ways, where we have been able, as geneticists, to track down different causes in different families. Okay, so there's not one gene. There's hundreds and hundreds of genes that can carry a mutation that increases the risk of autism. Now,
Right.
things get really complex here because those mutations tend to not just increase the risk of autism, but they also increase the risk of ADHD, of epilepsy, of even things like schizophrenia, depression, and so on. So there's a sort of a general psychiatric risk that can come about. And most of these genes are genes that are involved in wiring the brain or putting basically brain development of some way.
Right.
So the general idea is that, it takes thousands and thousands of different genes to put our brain together. It's an incredibly complicated system and the self-assembly of it is incredibly complicated. So mutations that affect any of those genes can alter brain development in ways that can manifest in one person as autism, in another person as epilepsy, in another person as ADHD, and so on. And you can see that even in identical twins, where, if one of them has autism, the chances are very high, almost 80%, that the other one will also have autism, but they might not, right? So sometimes they don't, and sometimes they might have some other condition. Right. So the genetics is very complex, but we're learning more and more about it all the time. We're identifying more and more of these risk genes and the mutations in those genes that increase risk. Even within an individual, it's not just the effect of one gene. There's a genetic background. There might be multiple mutations. So so it makes it a really messy story, hard to talk about, hard for us to understand. But still, the overall picture is that by far the majority of the risk for autism comes from genetic differences between people. Right. Now, that does leave a little bit unexplained, where you might say, okay, so something like 80% of the variance in risk of autism is genetic in origin. But what about that other like 20%? What's that? And people often assume if it's not genes, it must be environment. Right? That's just a sort of a typical division that people make. But actually, there's a whole other source of variation that people overlook, which is just the process of development itself. So the genome is not like a blueprint that deterministically specifies the outcome of embryonic development. It's more like it's more like a recipe, actually, where there's all these sort of processes. It sets up some kind of biochemical rules, and the way those rules play out then will determine the way your brain actually develops. So that's why, the brains of identical twins are very, very similar to each other, but they're not actually identical, because every time you run the program, there's a little bit of variation.